All right, welcome to Lab 10 for INST 239 PID control applications. In this lab, we are going to be working on two activities out of the workbook. First one up is activity 47.1. 47.1 ties together the last two labs that we did. It puts a cascade control loop in with a split range controller. An example of where this is done is textbook page 600 in your textbook has a reactor. And so what it says is a batch reactor is used for an exothermic reaction. Temperature of the reactor needs to be raised to a set point and kept there until the reaction is complete. Okay, this is very common in industry. So what we have to do is as the reaction gets started in a batch reaction, the reaction is not going to happen unless we have heat in it. Okay, so what that means is we add steam in with this steam control valve through a jacket right here. So this steam control valve adds steam into this heater, and we pump that heated water through a jacket, and that raises the temperature of the reactor. Once the temperature gets up to a certain point, the exothermic reaction kicks off, gets started, and that exothermic reaction generates heat, which means that it's going to be providing its own heat in the reactor. Then we can cool it down and just maintain that temperature with this control valve right here. But we want one controller to be able to do it. Okay, and so we are going to add a cascade controller to that. So what we are looking at here is what should be cascaded for best control. And so when we ask ourselves about a cascade controller, the first thing we want to know is what are we actually trying to control? And in this case, we're trying to control the temperature of the material inside the reactor. And we're also measuring the temperature of the jacket material, but that's not as important. That's just what we need to be able to have to get the reactor at the right temperature. So this is our primary controller for a cascade control loop. So we make a controller TIC 01 because we're coming off of TT01, and so that should be cascaded. That's our primary controller. Now, where does that go? Well, something that's going to give us quicker response, better, more accurate control is if we look at this reactor jacket temperature right here. And if we want the reactor to be cooling, we want to make sure this point is lower than what's in the reactor, because the jacket temperature isn't going to be exactly what's in the reactor, depending on whether we're heating or we're cooling. Okay, so this will be our secondary controller, and we'll call it TIC02. We're going to bring in a set point from our primary controller, TIC01, into here. Okay, this will be in cascade mode. Process variable will come from temperature transmitter O2, and then our manipulated variable will go to these two control valves. So we're adding in a split range action as well as the cascade action. Okay, and so number one, what should be cascaded for best control? TT01 should go into a primary controller that goes into a secondary controller, TIC02, which should get its PV from TT02, and the output of that controller should go into these two control valves. The failure action of the chilled water valve. So this one should be basic and simple at this point. When we're talking about cooling, when we're talking about chilled water, they're always going to be fail open in most all cases. So fail open, which means we put air on it to close. The failure action of the steam control valve, that's going to be the exact opposite, fail close. So anytime we're heating up material, we want that to have a failure of a fail closed position. So if anything happens, we're going to be at a cooled state. Most of the time in the industry, that's how we're going to want those to happen. If there's a failure, we want it to be colder, cooler. Hotter is usually more hazardous, so cooler is almost always better. What is the desired portion of the control signal that goes to the chilled water return valve? Well, when we're in the failed open side, that means we're going to be operating on the low range. So at 4 milliamps, we're going to be fully open. And so that means what we want is the 4 to 12 milliamp portion of this should be on the cooling side. And that's almost always the case when we're using split range control valves. The 12 to 20 milliamp then would be the answer to number 5. The portion of the control signal to TV 202 should be the 12 to 20 milliamp range. So the first half, the side that's on the low end, that 4 to 12 milliamps, will be on our cooling side. And then our 12 to 20 milliamps will be on our heating side, okay? And that's because the air to open, we want that to be up past 12, means we're going to be open. Once we get past 12 here, that means we're going to be air to close. That means we're going to be fully closed. We don't want both of these valves to be open at the same time unless something really weird is happening or some kind of a purge cycle is happening, because what we want at 12 milliamps is both of these valves to be closed. So 4 to 12 for our chilled water portion of the control signal input, and 12 to 20 for our steam valve portion of the control signal input. The desired action. So is this going to be a direct or reverse acting controller? Well, for the reactor temperature controller, very simple way to do it is just plug in some numbers just like we've always done. Let's just give this a set point. Since the book doesn't give us one, we'll give it a set point of 200 degrees. And let's just say hypothetically we're at 205 and increasing. Well, what do we want to do? Well, here it's not going to a control valve. Here it's going to another controller. Well, that other controller reads what the jacket temperature is. So if we're at 205 degrees and increasing, but we want to be at 200, what do we want in that jacket? We want cooler water in that jacket, okay? And so 190, and we want that to be dropping, okay? These two arrows are going opposite directions, just like we've saw before all semester long. So that's a reverse acting controller. So number 6 is reverse acting. Now, the secondary controller here, set point, again, remember this is a cascade controller, so this is going to be changing based off TIC 01. Now that doesn't change the fact of whether it's reverse or direct acting. Just remember that operator doesn't put this in here. It comes from this controller. So we give this the same kind of a thing, right? The set point comes in at 190. Let's say this jacket temperature here is actually at 200. What do we want to have happen? We want this manipulated variable to be going down, okay? Down, now does that mean, what does that mean? Is it different for the chilled water return or for the steam? And the answer is no, because they are actions of each of these are different. And so this is going to be air to open, which means if we're putting a less control signal, we're putting less air into the valve. Less air into the valve means it's not going to be open as much, so it's going to be closing more. And if we're putting less signal into this, it's not going to be closing as much. It's air to close. So if we put less signal into it, it's going to be opening more. If this valve's closing more, that means we're getting cooler. Less steam, less heat, we're getting cooler. If we're putting less air into this, that means it's opening more. So we're getting cooler again. More chilled water return allowing to go out into the cooling tower. Okay, the more chilled water return we have going out to the cooling tower, the more that comes into the supply. That means the more that we're going to be able to cool this down. So as the control signal here goes down, less air goes in to open this valve, providing less heat. Less air goes in to close this valve, providing more cooling. So this is a reverse acting controller, and that reverse action actually has the same effect based on these two valves. And then number 8 says complete the PNID. That's on page 288. So if you just draw something in, take a picture of it, and then should look pretty much what I have drawn up here. Controllers might look a little bit different. You can call them a little bit different numbers if you want, but that should be pretty standard since we're talking 01 for the primary element right here, and then 02 for the primary element right here. There have to be a TIC, temperature indicating controller. Make it look a little bit different than that, but it should be something along those lines for number 8. Okay, so hopefully that was somewhat of a review for the cascade control and the split range control from the previous labs. Now the next half of the lab goes into activity 48, and this is a high selector switch problem. Okay, and so what we have here is the description of this is on 291 in your workbook, and it's kind of long, but basically what happens is we have an electrolyzer that's used to generate chlorine and hydrogen gas. Okay, this only works when the system and controls and everything, when the system is already up to pressure. And so we have to purge this out with air pressure. And so we have a very tight window, a very narrow range that we want to control this system at, this electrolyzer system at, this gas generation system. And so what we need is we need a very tight control on here. Well, if we're bringing it up to pressure, we don't want to have a very tight control on that. We want to have a quick control. Okay, so we have a wide range here for when we're bringing it up to pressure or depressurizing it. We have that for this one and this controller. And so why do we need a system like this? Since we didn't get to have a lecture this week, why did we need a system like this? Well, this should be kind of an example. Here would be PIC01. Okay, that would be something like this. We're at big change, high gain, low integral. It's going to respond quickly. Okay, we want it to get up to pressure as quickly as we can. Overshoot should be okay because it's just compressed air in here. Okay, so it doesn't really matter so much. We have a high gain. We want it to happen quick. We want there to be control there. We don't want it to get just on-off. We don't just want it to be an on-off control. We want to have some control over it, but it can be. We want it to respond quickly. We don't want it to respond very slow. But here on this, on the narrow range PIC02, we want to put in a low gain and a large integral because we want tighter control. So this is what we want. We want basically PIC02 to look like this. We want it to have a slow, very controlled response. We don't want a really high or low overshoot with this electrolyzer. And so what we have to do is we have to put in two different controllers so that we're not constantly having to change the proportion of the integral, any of those, the gain or the rate or anything like that for the reset time for any of these controllers when we're on the fly. We don't want operators doing that on the fly, and so we simply put in two different controllers and have a selector. Now this is going to be a high selector. It's a high selector because when we're on the low side, we want it to go to PIC01. And then once we get up high enough, once we get up to pressure, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 PSI, we want this selector to select and then start controlling off of PIC02. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about this on number 4. But questions number 2, it should be say 2 and 3 here. Are we a direct or reverse action? Number 2 is the wide range controller PIC01 is that direct or reverse action. And so if we simply just plug in the numbers just like we did before, if we have a set point say of 5.05 and our process variable is 5.5, we want this valve to be opening more, right? So we wanted these two line up, so we want it to be direct acting. And this matters based on where the transmitter is in relation to the valve. We want this valve to open more, okay, and push more, let more material go out. Okay, it's a fail close, so air to open, so we want to open more out so that we can control this and relieve that pressure. Okay, so that's a direct acting controller. Now, it's pressure. This is still before the valve, so PIC02 is the same thing. Just because it's a tighter control and narrower range, it doesn't matter. It's still direct action. Okay, if we get above the set point, we want this valve to open, so we want our manipulated variable to be open. And this is what we want them to kind of look like. And this doesn't matter direct or reverse, but this is kind of showing you what it should look like, why we have two different controllers and a selector switch in general. Is this should be what PIC01 sees, quick action. We can overshoot, that's all right. We just wanted to get there and get to set point rather quickly. But once PIC02 takes over, very slow changes. We want it to be very, very tight control. So the PID optimization is going to be a little bit different. And so we put in a selector switch with those parameters to be able to select between those. But number 2 and number 3 should both be direct. Just because it's a wide range and narrow range, that doesn't change the fact that they're direct or reverse acting. If these were on the opposite side, or this valve was different, or different things were happening here, if it was letting material into a system, then we would say we might change those, but for right now it's just a direct acting controller. Both of them are. Now number 4, it's kind of tricky. What is that point of the wide range pressure controller so there'll be no interference on the narrow range pressure controller? Well, what we want is the set point to be at 5.25. You got to do a little bit of math to be able to figure this out, and you got to convert from inches of water column into PSI. But if we look at that 5.25 PSI is above the upper limit of this pressure controller. So it's just above 145 inches of water column equals 5.25 PSI. So what this is going to mean is this selector is going to be selected on PIC01. So PIC01 is going to be active. Now, during that time, PIC02 is still doing all of its calculations and spitting out an output, but the selector is just not allowing that output to go directly to the valve. That output's just sitting there, just not really doing anything. It's just kind of sitting there, not really doing much, just calculating what it would do if it was going to the valve. Once we get up to this set point, this selector relay triggers, the high side triggers and says, switch it over, go into PIC02. And then when that happens, now PIC01 is no longer active, so its output doesn't go anywhere. PIC02 is now under control. And why this works good is this transfer works good is this has been doing its thing the whole time. It's been reading the error, it's been reading the integral, it's been doing everything, it's been, it's been providing an output. It's just that output hasn't been going anywhere. Okay, and so then once it takes over, then this output can go somewhere and it goes into the valve, and so we don't see big drastic swings with the pressures on this valve because they're both reading the pressures at the same line. They're just reading a different range, and they just are going to have the controllers respond quicker or slower. So the set point of this should be 5.25 psi for number 4, and we get that because that's going to go up, and it's actually going to be it's going to go all the way up and get above its target, right above the 145, and then that way the valve is open, it's releasing material out, and then we are controlling down from that 145 and letting it bleed back down into that 140 range. We kind of give it a little bit of overshoot when we're purging it with air, and then allowing as that electrolyzer comes up, then it's going to be working. And if we didn't have it that high, then both controllers would want to be controlling at the same range, and then we might have some interference with those. And so this allows us to not have interference because it doesn't switch until it's already up at the high end of this range, and then this can take over and run it while the electrolyzer is running and that gas generator is running. All right, as always, let me know if you have any questions. Submit the lab via Blackboard. And that's all I have for today.